Morning arrived without announcement. There was no sharp change in the light, no moment that suggested something important was about to be decided. The river moved as it always had, unbothered by the weight of yesterday, carrying its surface calmly downstream, as though it had never learned to pause. Toad noticed this, and for reasons he could not name, the familiarity unsettled him. He had expected something, a sign, a shift, some visible mark that would tell him where things now stood. Instead, everything appeared settled already, as if the world had reached a conclusion without needing him present. Rhett and Mole were there before him. They spoke quietly, not in secret, but with the economy of people who no longer believed that words could alter what was coming. Badger stood slightly apart, his posture relaxed, his attention elsewhere, as though he were waiting for the moment to pass, rather than for anyone to arrive. Toad stepped closer. No one turned immediately. When they did acknowledge him, it was not with avoidance, but with something more disorienting, completion. The conversation had ended. The space for disagreement had already closed. Badger spoke first, his voice even, unhurried. "It's been decided," he said. Toad waited for the rest of the sentence. It did not come. "Decided how?" Toad asked, keeping his tone light, as though the answer might still be flexible. Badger met his eyes. "That arrangements will be made," he said for a while. The words settled heavily, not because they were harsh, but because they were final. They did not invite argument. They did not require agreement. Toad laughed once, a short sound meant to signal confidence. "Well," he said, "we should talk about that." Rat shook his head gently, not in refusal, but in recognition. "There isn't much to discuss," he replied. "It's already moving." That was what struck Toad most, the absence of urgency. No one rushed, no one pressed him. There was no tone of punishment, no trace of accusation. The decision did not need defending. Mole shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable, not with the outcome, but with how little discomfort it seemed to cause anyone else. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as though remembering that sympathy did not create options. Toad felt something tighten in his chest. "Where will I be?" he asked. Badger answered without hesitation. "That will be handled." The phrase landed badly. Handled. Not discussed, not adjusted, handled. Toad glanced toward the path that led back to his house, imagining for a moment that he might simply turn and walk away. But the thought lacked force. It did not carry the weight it once had. Somewhere behind him, the river pressed steadily against its bank, testing nothing, demanding nothing, continuing on a course that did not account for preference. "So that's it," Toad said. "Just like that." Badger nodded. "Yes," he replied, "just like that." There was no triumph in the answer, no satisfaction, only certainty. Toad looked at each of them in turn, searching for hesitation, for doubt, for some small crack where his words might still matter. He found none. For the first time, he understood that the decision had not been made against him. It had simply been made without him, and that, more than any consequence, left him standing very still, unsure of where to place his weight, now that the ground beneath him no longer waited for permission. Waiting changed the shape of the day. It did not announce itself, did not arrive with instructions, but settled quietly into the hours, stretching them thin, until movement began to feel unnecessary. Time did not stop, it simply slowed, as though it were no longer in a hurry to bring anything new. Toad noticed first how little there was to do. No one asked him questions. No one sought his opinion, even small decisions. Where to stand, when to eat, which path to take seemed to resolve themselves before he reached them. He tried to fill the space. At first he spoke, not loudly, not defensively, but with the familiar rhythm of someone used to being heard. He talked about improvements he could make, about adjustments, about how things might still turn out well, if given the proper attention. Rat listened politely, his focus drifting now and then to the river, to the sky, to anything that suggested the conversation was no longer required. Mole nodded at the appropriate moments, his agreement careful, as though he were responding. To something already past, Badger said nothing. Toad adjusted his approach. He began to plan aloud, describing steps, timelines, reasonable compromises. He spoke of future mornings that would look very much like old ones, of routines restored, of normalcy returning. Once the unnecessary waiting was over, the words moved cleanly into the air and disappeared. They did not meet resistance. They did not invite response. They simply failed to settle anywhere. Toad paused, listening to the silence that followed, and felt the first real erosion. Of his certainty, he tried remembering instead. He spoke of earlier days, of victories, of moments when his enthusiasm had carried everyone forward. He laughed at the right places, waiting for the familiar echo of shared recognition. It did not come. Not because the memories were disputed, but because they no longer applied. The past remained intact, but it had stopped negotiating on his behalf. The waiting continued. Meals arrived without ceremony. Conversations ended before he was ready. The day rearranged itself around his presence, accommodating him. Without centering him, Toad felt strangely intact and entirely displaced. Nothing had been taken from him directly, no door had been closed in his face. Yet with each passing hour, the sense of standing at the center of things thinned until he felt himself drifting to the edges of decisions already underway. He realized then that waiting was not neutral. It was not an empty pause between actions, but a quiet force, wearing down urgency, smoothing intention until effort itself began to feel out of place. Toad stopped speaking. Not in protest, not in surrender, but because the words no longer found a surface to rest upon. He stood by the river, watching how it accepted every delay without complaint, how it continued forward without marking the cost. For the first time, Toad understood that movement did not always belong to those who moved first. Sometimes it belonged to whatever remained after everything else had already begun. It settled more deeply, as though the day had decided this was the shape it preferred. Nothing urgent arrived to disturb it, nothing dramatic announced a change, and yet something was shifting. Toad felt it first as a slight misalignment, the way a room can feel unfamiliar, even when every object remains in place. He stood near the river, hands clasped behind his back, watching the surface move. Without acknowledging him, the water did not wait. It did not accelerate. It simply continued, unimpressed by his attention and unaffected by his absence. Earlier, this would have irritated him. He would have commented on it, made a remark, turned the moment into something responsive. Now, he only noticed how unnecessary that impulse felt. Rat sat a short distance away, leaning comfortably against a tree. He had not spoken in some time, not because there was nothing to say, but because saying it no longer seemed required. His gaze followed the river's bend, not tracking progress, only presence. Mole wandered closer, then stopped, unsure whether he was interrupting anything or joining something already complete. He offered Toad a glance, gentle and unassuming, as though checking not for readiness, but for balance. Badger remained where he had been all along, solid, unmoving, a reference point rather than a participant. Toad became aware, slowly and with some discomfort, that no one was watching him. Not waiting for his reaction, not measuring his response, not adjusting their own pace. To accommodate his, the realization did not arrive sharply. It seeped in, filling the spaces where attention used to be. He shifted his weight, cleared his throat, then stopped. The sound felt too loud, as though it belonged to an earlier version of the day. For a moment, he considered leaving. The idea came easily. He could walk away, return to familiar paths, restore a sense of motion. That did not require permission. The option was intact. Nothing prevented it. That, somehow, made it less appealing. Instead, he stayed. He noticed how the light had changed, not dramatically, but enough to soften the edges of things. Reflections on the water stretched longer. Colors settled into quieter agreements. Even sounds seemed to respect the slower tempo, each noise arriving with space around it. Toad sat down. The act surprised him. He had not planned to rest. He had not announced it. His body simply decided that standing no longer added anything. From this lower vantage, the world looked different, not smaller, but less performative. The river did not look like something to be crossed. The trees did not suggest destinations. Everything existed without pointing elsewhere. Time moved, but without agenda. Toad felt a faint unease. The kind that comes not from danger, but from unfamiliar freedom, if nothing demanded his effort. What was he meant to do with himself? The question lingered, then slowly dissolved. He realized that the waiting had already done its work, not by forcing him into stillness, but by making motion optional. Urgency had thinned, leaving behind something quieter and heavier. Attention. He noticed his breathing, not to control it, not to improve it, but simply because it was there. He noticed the texture of the ground, the temperature of the air, the way the river did not ask to be understood. For the first time, he did not feel behind, nor did he feel ahead. He felt placed. Badger shifted slightly, just enough to be noticed. He did not speak, but his presence carried weight, as though it marked a boundary between what had been and what was now unavoidable. Toad sensed, without fully forming the thought, that this pause was not the end. It was not resolution, it was preparation. Something would come, not immediately, not announced, but inevitably. And when it did, it would not respond to who Toad had been, it would respond to who he was becoming in this quiet, unclaimed space. The river continued, uninterrupted, and somewhere beyond the bend. Out of sight, but not out of reach, the current was already changing.